Are you one of those people who habitually watches shows and movies right before bed, almost like a routine? Fret not, you aren't the only one. I think if we were to look at the modern century, it is very much the image, the idea, and isn't very much a stretch to say that most people would find watching movies and their favorite shows as the pastime of their bedtime. And after a very long day, when we're done with everything, in bed we'll probably be hugged to our laptops, tablets, phones, and watching away. And what's very interesting is that for many people, this is much more than a routine. For many of us, we feel that if we don't actually watch these shows or the movies, we simply can't sleep. To such an extent that it feels very much like an addiction. Why exactly does this happen? Why are we so addicted? What about them really draws us in? It is very much like addiction. And indeed, researchers in the field of psychology, for example, Robert Kubey, he's actually found a lot of similarities between people who are addicted to television and also people who are addicted to drugs, in the same sense that both groups, drug users and people who are watching TV, they find it very hard to actively reduce the use of these things. They tend to use much more than they intend, and if they don't do these things, they suffer withdrawal symptoms. Of course, we're talking about two very different types of addiction. Addiction to drugs is of course very hazardous, and addiction to television at most impacts your life in different ways, yet the dynamics are very similar. Why are we so addicted? What makes it so addictive? For example, why aren't we addicted to books instead? Why are we addicted to shows? Take a moment to think about that. It actually takes an effort, almost this deliberate action, to develop an interest to read books. Yet it is entirely effortless. The moment we turn on a show, a movie, we're instantly drawn in. It's effortless. Why the disparity? Is there something at play here? Well, according to Kubey, there is. The reason why we find TV more addictive than books really lies with the way that we've evolved, our minds have evolved. Kubey suggests that television is able to activate our orienting response, which is an instinctive response to audio and visual stimuli in environment. So for example, when something moves or we hear this sudden loud noise, we instantly look at it. And the reason why is because we've evolved to respond to these sudden stimuli in a very immediate way, in a way that we can't control. We are just drawn to it. And television, whether it is a show or movie, they're essentially a bombardment of all of these stimuli that instantly hooks us in our orienting response. You can just think about it, the scene of a car going by, or an explosion, or people talking, and all these different sceneries. It is just a bombardment of all the stimuli that is constantly drawing and hooking onto our attention. Of course, we can't say the same things with books. It is literally just letters on a page, printed. It requires an imagination, but of course deliberate action. But of course we can see the instinctiveness of this addiction television to this orienting response. For example, Kubey discovered that babies, even if they were on the floor lying down, if something was actually on television, on a screen and making sound and all these visual cues, these babies would actually turn their heads and look at it. They can't help but do that. And at least on this instinctive level, we can see why we are so drawn to television. It is really a link to this instinctive built-in sensitivity to movement, sound, and visual cues. So certainly from this perspective, we can see why a flickering and noisy box can get our attention, but doesn't exactly explain some more peculiar circumstances. For example, think about your favorite sitcom. For many people, this could be the show Friends, a show that's been around for a very long time, that many of us probably seen more than 10 or 20 times in terms of its reruns. Yet, we have a habit of actually putting it on, and for many people, an actual religious routine, playing it in the background and just listening and watching in on these fictional people interacting. Yet we feel so drawn in that we're part of them. We want to understand what's going on with them. We're totally captivated by the social interaction that's going on. Why is that? Well, this really draws us to the sort of social experience that us humans are also instinctively evolved to really value and naturally be curious about. The first person to really highlight this was of course Aristotle, who said that humans are by nature social creatures. And of course, Aristotle was proven right, because eventually evolutionary psychologists, they've discovered that human beings, they've actually evolved and lived through 300 million years in these social, tightly knit groups. But what is really interesting in the field of evolutionary psychology is that it's been discovered that besides us being social, we have a natural inclination to actually build our own social understanding and to try and expand it as much as possible through experience. This, of course, will allow us to actually learn how to live better with groups of people and the social communities that we're part of. Of course, today it is a much wider community than a tribe, but this is something that's been evolved and hardwired into us. Interestingly, in 1992, psychologist Tooby actually discovered that we are more inclined and more interested and also more capable of solving logical problems when they're reframed from a social angle. In other words, we have a natural inclination towards this social aspect, and we're fascinated by these things compared to others. And there's even a theory, the Machiavellian intelligence hypothesis, which stipulates that primate intelligence, our ancestors, they evolved intelligence largely to deal with these social problems that are getting incredibly more complex with the increasing size of these tribes. In a similar vein, Robin Dunbar coined the social gossip theory, the idea that language was also evolved really as an attempt for us to navigate more complex social relationships. All in all, these research actually point to the fact that for all of us, we have a natural inclination to constantly expand our social experience. It's instinctive for us to want to watch social interactions as an attempt to really navigate our social worlds. In other words, when we're watching these sitcoms, just people talking and hanging out, the reason why we enjoy it is it's very instinctive. We've evolved to enjoy these things as an attempt for us to develop better social cues. And that's why we find such great pleasure and fascination with all these interactions, which can certainly explain why for many of us, we just enjoy hearing people interacting with one another in the background when we're about to sleep or when we're doing our work. Whatever may be, the reason why we are so addicted to it is this. It is very much a part of who we are. There is an evolutionary pull that we can't deny. But aside from this, why is it that when we are so caught up with a certain show, let's say Money Heist, we just can't help but want to finish every episode? And for some of us, we might sit through it in a single night, all the episodes in a single season. What is the science behind binge watching that? Well, interestingly, this also has to do with the way that human memory has evolved. If you look at the work of Ziegarnik, she found out that when we are interrupted with a certain task that we're doing, our minds are actually able to remember the task 90% better than if we were uninterrupted. This could explain why waiters at restaurants are able to remember all the orders really well, yet when the bill is paid, they totally forget about it. Our minds are actually evolved to put a mental tab on the thing that we are doing that's not complete yet, and it stays in this tab with a memory advantage until we actually complete it. So it is constantly in the back of your mind and just ingrained that, which could seek to explain why for many of us, when we watch a certain show and we don't finish it, it's just there in our mind, resonating. Yet beyond that, Ziegarnik also discovered the theory of closure, the idea that there is also this drive in our mind beyond just the remembrance of the task we've not completed, this constant reminder that we should complete it. In other words, this need instinctively to end the things that are kept as an open tab in our memories. So certainly from this perspective, we can see why most of us feel natural to want to finish a show really quickly, because we just can't forget these things that are left open in our minds, and there's almost this instinctive pull for us to have closure as soon as possible. Yet the very interesting research that we can really also add on to this understanding is also the way that story works for the human mind. In 1979, psychologists Owensbauer and Black discovered that when you give test participants a series of things that they have to remember about a certain person and the things they did in a certain day, people might struggle when the list is very long. But when you introduce an element of a story, if you give them a context of why the person was doing that certain thing, instantly these participants can remember them really well. In other words, our brains are naturally designed to process narrative and is more inclined to accept narrative than anything else, which can explain why most of us are so captivated by shows and movies that revolve around great narratives rather than, for example, something that is non-fiction, like a documentary. We humans have a natural tendency to consume stories, and part of the reason why also ties back really to the research and field of evolutionary psychology that I mentioned, our natural inclinations to social interaction. So ultimately, what I'm trying to say in tonight's chat is that most of us, we're drawn to these shows and these movies, not because we might have weak willpower or that our lives are boring, but because we have evolved minds that instinctively enjoys consuming television. And that's why the love for movies and shows is almost universal for all of us for these reasons. But that is not to say that all of a sudden with these research, we have a legitimate excuse to just indulge indulge excessively in all the movies and shows that we enjoy. If our instinctive pastime challenges our lives in certain ways, it affects our work, our social relationships, then we have to do a pullback as well. Because despite the fact that we might have these instinctive drives evolve into us, we humans, after all, are also gifted with the unique ability to act against our instincts, unlike animals. And so we need to know that although it is very natural for all of us to want to watch as much TV as possible, sometimes that isn't the best thing to do. And if anything, these research actually shows us that the draw of great entertainment is truly very great. And with that, understanding that, we also have to realize that it really comes from a side of our irrationality, our instincts, and that we have to exert rational control too. But this is something to think about next time when you catch up with your favorite episode or the latest movie. Cheers.